As a DP, one of the most important things, if not the most important thing, is knowing how to light a scene properly. Because once you understand and you master the basics, then you move on to understanding the motivation of why you're lighting a scene in a particular way. Because lighting isn't just technical, it's psychological as well. It shapes the way that people feel before they even know why. If you're new here, my name's Keaton. I am a DP based in Oklahoma. I also developed this app called Cinetemp. Cinetemp's a quick way to find the white balance of a room. And new in version 2.0, we also introduced the ability to calculate the ND needed for a given scene. Let's move on to point 1, which is lighting starts with emotion. Now, getting into this to set some context, I'm going to assume that you know the basics, and so we're going to be talking about the motivation behind light. We'll cover my process and motivation for finding a lighting style for a particular job, and then how to identify yours. I mainly come from a commercial background, so that's the perspective I'll be sharing from today. First, I want to talk about my approach to lighting when it first lands on my desk. When I first start reading a treatment, I don't think about gear first, I think about these things in order. The first being the product. Is it a person? Is it a space? Is it a service? That's the first thing we need to identify because that's the lenses that we need to look through, and that will dictate what we do later on. The second thing we need to think through is, what is the audience supposed to feel? If we're selling summer vibes, then obviously a project needs to feel happier, and a lot of the times that's done by making it brighter and maybe giving it a hard edge or something that stands out a little bit. Now, if the product demands a little bit more attention or has something that has some grit to it, then we need to lean into the contrast and the color theory of that. Those are two very different examples, but that's the lenses that we need to read scripts through. We need to figure out what the audience needs to feel. And then lastly, we need to figure out what the character or the product wants to say without words. Because like it or not, a lot of the times whenever people are watching our spots, especially if it's commercial stuff, they're going to watch it without sound. Just based on the analytics and data of social media, a lot of the times there is no script when someone is watching an ad. So you need to tell the story of the product with your light with no sound. Just really quick, I want to talk through an example that I think demonstrates this pretty well. We did a project with a local nonprofit that focused around a story of a lady who had a lot of trauma in the past and eventually worked through that, not only with herself, but also with the help and guidance of this nonprofit. But the lighting in this video changes pretty dramatically from the beginning to the end. In the beginning, we had some very dark scenes which reflected what had happened in her childhood. Her interview was dimly lit, but soft. And then as we move into the redemptive part of the story, the light gets a lot brighter and warmer to embrace the hope that's going on inside of that story. Now, all that being said, your job as a DP is not just to create pretty images. It's to understand the emotional purpose that's going on behind the scenes and embrace the story in that way. That being said, that brings me to section 2, which is light and subject relationship. As I've established in a roundabout way, light itself is a character as much as the lead product or the character in the film. Whenever you're DPing a project, especially if you're on your first large project, I think it's easy to get caught up in a light by light mentality. Raise this light 1 point, raise that light 1 point. But to me, as I progressed in the industry, what I've found is I've almost shifted into a connective light mentality. And what I mean by connective light is the thing that shapes every visual element and ties the entire scene together. I think it's important to go into your lighting recipes and your lighting plans with a mindset that your light affects how everything in the scene relates to everything else, including the script. As you've heard it said before, light spaces, not faces. And by that, I think a lot of people mean don't just focus on the product and the lighting on the product. You need to feel the entire environment. So make your entire environment feel natural. In addition to that, I think it's important that a DP understands how a subject or subjects relate, not only to the story, but to the viewer as well. Because light defines those dynamics, either consciously or subconsciously. For example, if we have two characters in a film and they are lit in the same way, then they're connected. But if we have two characters in a film and one is bright and then one is dark in the shadows in the background, that creates a totally different dynamic. Good lighting doesn't just define the subject, it creates the emotional geometry, if you will, of everything in the scene. And that brings me on to section 3, which is working with, not against, environments. If a project is fortunate enough to give me a scout, a lot of the times I take my time and I figure out exactly what the sun and the location is going to give me. Now, sometimes you have to do that on the fly, which makes that a little bit more complicated. You just basically have to do the same process, but in 5 minutes rather than in 1 hour. Irregardless, whether we're on a scout or we're flying in blind, the first thing that I do whenever I arrive on a location is ask myself, what does the space itself naturally give me? And then if we're outdoors or even if we're indoors, the next things that I do is pull out Sunseeker and track the plot of the sun and figure out how the sun will be affecting me throughout that scene. And then the last thing that I do is pull out Cinetemp and measure the white balance of the room just to give me an idea of what lights I should bring in, whether I need daylight or if I need something that's more variable. Working with an environment, not against it, every time we're shooting a commercial, we need the product to stand out from the scene, but a lot of the times we need that to feel natural. And to me, a lot of the times the best way to do that, unless we're going after a very specific look, is to enhance what is already there, not replacing it. So like I said earlier, if we have a really strong window light, I would say enhance that by either bringing a negative fill or just making the subject pop a little bit more than the background is already popping from the window fill. Or if you're shooting outdoors, try to make your product stand out in a different way. A lot of times for me, whenever we're running fast, right now my favorite go-to is just a foam core balance that I built from Home Depot. It's like $40 depending on where you live. But essentially what it is a soft silver on one side and then a hard silver on the other side. But just bringing an edge or a balance a lot of the times will make the product itself stand out from the background. That brings me to section 4, which is lighting outdoors. Now, lighting outdoors, of course, if you had unlimited time and budget, there's a ton of different ways to do it. But for me, coming in the commercial world, a lot of the times I'm working with a pretty small to medium-sized crew, and so we need to embrace the mindset of controlling the uncontrollable. I've been in the industry about 10 years, and I've seen it done a lot of different ways, but at the end of the day, I think there's no way to ever fight the sun. You just have to embrace it and modify it in the way that you want it modified. So whenever you're shooting outdoors, find the best locations for that. For me, I use Sunseeker. I'll find shade, or I will find direct sun and shoot in that if I want to embrace the direct sun. But you need to find and plan your days around the correct time, contrast ratio, and angle and location of the sun. There's no way to just completely remove the sun. It's going to be ruining your background or ruining your subject if you don't like the way that it's falling. For me, a lot of the times, if we're outdoors, I'll diffuse the light on the main subject if we're in our tights, but on our wides, sometimes we just let it rock. And then sometimes whenever we're in our tights and we want to really embrace that summer feel, we will just give them a hard edge, and sometimes from multiple different directions. And as a quick example, here's a scene that we shot for a bank commercial, and we really just wanted to embrace the sun and give that hot summer vibe, even though we're in mid-fall at this point. We just gave them a hard edge from several different directions and really embraced that hard light, which I think enhances the summer vibe of that. Now, like I said earlier, if we had unlimited budget, I think there's several different things that we would do, but for me, the overall takeaway with lighting outdoors is that lighting outdoors isn't necessarily about the gear. There's cheap ways that you can do it, and there's ways that you can be creative and do it. I think lighting outdoors is really about adaptability. Now, that brings me on to section 5, which is building a lighting philosophy. Every DP at some point in their career will build their own lighting philosophy, whether they realize it or not. For me, it starts with the emotion behind the project. I get a heading for that, and I start marching in that direction. Second, I analyze the locations that we'll be shooting in. Third, I simplify. I try to remove before I tried to add. And then lastly, I try to match the light quality to the story that's being told. You know, I think the longer you do it and the more opportunities and more reps you get, the more simple that these lighting recipes become. For me, I change my lighting recipes probably every 2 to 3 years. I find a new toy or I find a new tool or way that I like to do that. And that's the benefit of working with a lot of different crews and figuring out their styles. And I think that that's it. I think that's where we stop chasing the perfect light and we start chasing what feels right. The psychology of light is what separates the technically really talented from the storytellers. That's what's going to drive the emotion and connect with people. So the next time you're tasked with lighting a scene or a spot, don't start with, what's my setup going to be? Start with the question, what is the emotion of this project? And then back into the gear that way. That's whenever it stops being technical and starts being art. My name's Keaton and I'm sharing my journey and what I've learned along the way. If you enjoyed this video and want to continue growing together, consider subscribing. This is just the beginning of the conversation.